We're joined by our regular guest, Professor Salim Mansur, Professor Emeritus at Western University in London, Ontario. And today we're going to be discussing a little bit of a broad topic. We're going to be discussing the left. And what prompted this was Salim's rereading of an essay by Ayn Rand, or perhaps a couple of essays in her book, Ayn Rand, The New Left, The Anti-Industrial Revolution, also re-released as Return of the Primitive. And there's one essay in that sort of encapsulates, describes perfectly what we've been witnessing, even though it was written back in January of 1970. And that is a comparison of the people on the right to the god Apollo and the people on the left to the god Dionysus. The god Apollo, of course, is the god of, you could just encapsulate it as, say, reason. And the god Dionysus is, of course, Bacchus, the god of wine, the god of insanity, quite literally the god of insanity and chaos and randomness, and that she denotes to the left. And so, Salim, why don't we discuss some of the most current events, and particularly I'm looking at the absolute insanity, especially in Britain, of the groups, climate change groups, Extinction Rebellion, Stop Oil, splashing paint on priceless works of art in national galleries and getting away with it. No one seems to care. The rule of law is not seen, upheld. They know that they're going to get away with it, perhaps with a slap on the wrist. And all of this to stop oil, the very lifeblood of a civilized, modern lifestyle. If you go back 100 years before oil, maybe about 120, it was horse and buggy. People starved, people froze, and they want to go back to that time. And the left, as Rand would point out, is a culture of death, of not living on this earth. And in her essay, Apollo and Dionysus, she compares Apollo 11, when she wrote it, it was December of 69, January of 70, just months after she personally witnessed the launch of Apollo 11 and the heights and the ecstasy of man as a rational being, compared that to the events of August of 69, which of course was the Woodstock concert, where you had hundreds of thousands of young men and women wallowing in mud like pigs. And that event was exalted by the press as some sort of cultural revolution, while the Apollo 11 in the press, again, we always go back to the press, don't we, Salim? Apollo 11 was like, oh, well, wouldn't it be a shame if they failed? Or this is just a one-off, that kind of a thing. It was marginalized and forgotten. So, Salim, tell us, why read that book right now, and what can we get from this book 50 years later?
Well, the whole issue that we are confronting over these last couple of decades, but which has accelerated with the return of the Obama administration in terms of Biden, the third term of Obama administration, and the push, the accelerated push, which includes even the war in Ukraine that is at this moment going on, of the West against Russia, of the collective West against Russia, NATO and the European Union fully behind this war, of course, led by the United States. All of this raised the question, how so swiftly and so maddeningly the West, that you and I, and we have spoken about it, and we have grown up in it, spent in sense my entire life. By the way, I mean, the Woodstock festival in 1969 that you just referred to, and we can come back to it. And then, a month after that took place, a month after Neil Armstrong, took the giant leap for mankind, as he put it, on stepping on the moon. In 1969, I came just a few years after that to North America, in Canada, then he was in the United States, and then I returned. So these events remain dug in somewhere in my subconscious, and I was searching for a way. How can we bring this where we are, this new Green Deal, the totality of it, the whole globalist agenda, going back to the Earth Summit in 1992, man-made global warming, the carbon dioxide is a poison that we have to reach a net zero, and so on and so forth. So we're looking back at this entire period, and how can we encapsulate it and present it? And my mind, again, the subconscious works in its own mysterious way without getting into Freudian analysis over your issue, told me that there's something basically fundamentally primitive in all of this. That is what has gotten the Western man, this malady, this profound sickness that has overtaken the Western man. I mean, it's not coming from the country or the civilization that I left behind, right? From India. It's not coming from China. It's not coming from any of those third world countries that we talk about, less advanced, less modernized, less technologically, in terms of all that modernity represents in terms of science, technology, and so on and so on. It's not coming from there. It is the collective madness that is sweeping across the West, and perhaps we are reaching an end point of it, and maybe the pendulum will start swinging back, but how to explain it? And there, the word primitive triggered in my mind the book, Ayn Rand's book, So I reached into my library, and there it was. I had it. I have a different copy of it because yours, I think, the older version. Mine, again, is a paperback, republished sometime in the late 1970s. But I picked my copy up again as an undergraduate student in Toronto now, 45 plus years ago, and I read Ayn Rand's book. My one has further collection. I think there's about 4 or 5 essays by Peter Schwartz, and he writes the new introduction to it. But going back, and I read and reread this, The Return of the Primitive, and it was astounding. Rand had written that essay sometime in the late 60s or early 70s. I don't have the date right now in my head. And everything that she writes about is what we are living through. This is not a new debate. So it seems that's what then led me to go back and read even further. And that's the essay that you have now cited, Apollo and Dionysus. And that archetype characteristic of the two Greek gods. I mean, both Apollo and Dionysus were the sons of Zeus from 2 different mothers. And Apollo represents the archetype of the man or the individual, the person who is reasonable, who's rational, who puts reason at the top of his, priority. The world is a place which is reasonably constructed, rationally constructed by nature. It is about a man or a god who is prudent and who celebrates, most important to him, who celebrates and who represents order in the cosmology. It is not chaos. It is not randomness. It is order. And order has so many different features to it, Order is about discipline, about prioritizing, about setting things in a proper framework. It is hard work to construct an order. And of course, in Greek architecture, you see that the Apollonian feature in the Pantheon with the columns. And when you see buildings, you go to Washington and you see the architecture of Washington, the capital, it is Apollonian. It is, the geometry, the columns, the features have all sets that this capital of this new world, of this new republic, based upon constitutional order, is reaching back to reclaim what first began in Greece, in Parthenon, in Athens. And so that is the archetype that through Apollo we celebrate. And then there's the archetype, again, the brother of Apollo, or half-brother of Apollo, the son of Zeus, who represents the complete opposite, the antithesis of what Apollo represents in terms of order, reason, rationality, and the work that goes into it, that is the discipline, the toil, the work. This character of the Greek pantheon of gods and goddesses represents chaos, represents irrationality, represents insanity, but in that delirious frame of mind through celebration of the Bacchanalia, the Feast of Bacchanalia, wine drinking, intoxication, where an individual completely, basically strips himself and becomes part of what the individual imagines is nature, chaos, darkness, ultimately death, or the dissolution of everything that is constructed by the hard work of bringing order into a situation of chaos. So it is in this two archetype feature that we are all, in a sense, trapped. We carry that. And what are we celebrating? And I found that this is truly a fascinating, what Ayn Rand wrote 50 years ago is even more remarkable today if we pause and think about it, And this whole new Green Deal is the work of the Dionysian man. It's not the work of the Apollo man. And so in that essay that she presents this contradiction, this immense tension at work, is again beautifully laid out. And ironically, the coincidence of it, July 1969, Apollo takes off. And Apollo, the very name for the ship, the rocket that is going to carry the astronaut, is Apollo. That is, behind the ship, that is carrying Neil Armstrong and his other two co-astronauts to the moon, is the hard work, the toil of man at the epic of reason and rationality. It is order, it is science, and nothing there is left to chance. It is precision. It is to be precision means to be extremely disciplined, and all the subject the technology demands, mathematics, physics, engineering, is all precise and hard work. This is the very emblematic symbol of where the Western man has arrived at in terms of science and technology and philosophy, that now he can escape the earth and head to the stars, that's to the moon. And if it is not precise, if it is not carefully crafted, it will all blow up. And so the journey of Neil Armstrong carries the whole weight of a civilization of reason and rationality and achievement. And then a month later, there is Woodstock, a total chaos, as he said. Something like 500,000 people descended on a farming a village or a small town in New York, upstate New York, and it's total craziness, And who are they? On the one side, the people who work the Apollo project, and who then took the project to moon, that is Neil Armstrong and others, they belong to a generation that has come out, the generation in a sense that Ayn Rand herself identified. This is the generation that came of age after World War I. They came of age between the two world wars. They went to war in World War II. They fought and won. They came back. They're the one now in the literature, people talk about the greatest generation.
I think it was Walter Cronkite who may have coined that term to describe the generation that went to the moon, yeah, and that fought the Second World War.
Exactly. And so the greatest generation, I don't know who coined the term, but it was one of those Walter Cronkite or the man who replaced Walter Cronkite.
As a matter of fact, in the essay, Rand, it doesn't mention that in the essay, but Rand does say that Walter Cronkite was an exception to all the other pundits and journalists of the time, saying that he was the person who felt the passion of reason that was unfolding in front of him with Apollo 11 and subsequent Apollo missions, because people will remember, I certainly do, that Walter Cronkite was the voice of those missions. People tuned into him to watch those Apollo missions. And she praised him for it. She had nothing good to say about a lot of the other coverage of those things.
Yeah. She mentioned a few other names. One of the names that jumps out at me right now is Eric Severoid. Yes. I think Eric Severoid was a commentator on the NewsHour with Walter Cronkite. But so they were the greatest generation, you know. I mean, and you look back at the leadership in the West at that time in history that is still carrying on. And by the time that the Apollo mission takes place, 1969, they're still there. President Eisenhower, then comes President Kennedy, whose tragic death in 1963 marked again the descent into madness that will come. But President Kennedy represented that generation, you know, and it was his call that before the decade is out, man will go to the moon.
No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but a half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. And now, if America's new spacecraft succeeds in reaching Venus, we will have literally reached the stars before midnight tonight. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
And before the decade was out, man did go to the moon. That is 1969 Apollo 11 mission. So again, when you think about it in that historical sense of generation, people, achievement, and what all of this signifies, it is the achievement of the Apollo man. And then the month later, we see who comes, who descends on Woodstock, and what Woodstock then now historically can become the reference point of what sees the Western man, incrementally over time. But who were they? This was the boomer generation, right? Who are the boomer generation? People born, as was defined at that time, and I think we still stick to that particular period as a defining character of the boomer generation. People born between 1946 and 1966, that 20-year period, that is the children of the greatest generation. Pardon me?
You and I are boomers.
Yeah, I'm a boomer generation. I was born in the 50s. So we are the children of the greatest generation who goes to Woodstock. Who are the children of the greatest generation that comes to power then as the generational change takes place? Well, the Clintons, the George Bush, Donald Trump, Obama, they're all born in this period, This is the greatest. So I was a teenager at the Woodstock time, right? And way back in India, my generation, those who were tuned on to the West, were listening to the Beatles. I remember 1969, I was listening to Sgt. Pepper's Band, the album that came out, and in that sense, Beatles exemplify that culture of hippieism, the music, the rock, and everything associated with that. And what happens at Woodstock, it is again the exaltation of, how else can I put it, but the animal in us, the beast in us, the complete, shedding of every aspect of reason and rationality, and celebrating what Dionysus celebrates, insanity, madness, represented by free sex and open sex and intoxication with wine and drugs and LSD and marijuana and all of that,
It has to be said, though, Salim, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say it, that out of that period came some fantastic music. Now, I can go back, and I was a big Beatle fan, still am. George Harrison, George Harrison's almost every single one of his tunes is about reincarnation in Hinduism, if you read the subtext. And his Maharishi Mahesh Yogi type of teachings. And if you go back and look at the lyrics now, when I do that, I have to cringe somewhat at the infantile nature of some of the lyrics. Like John Lennon's Imagine. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, imagine that all you want, but it's not going to put bread on your table. And the man was a genius, a musical genius. And all of those people who played at Woodstock gave us some fantastic tunes and melodies and entertainment. But the philosophy behind what they were trying to preach, in most cases, was the Dionysus type of philosophy of, let's all just go back to nature and sing Kumbaya. And nature will provide. And this is what we're seeing with the anti-oil type of revolt, the Extinction Rebellion, revolt against humanity and modernity. We're seeing Woodstock played out writ large all over the West as people like a David Suzuki chaining himself to a tree, or people sticking their hands with super glue on the road and sitting in front of cars, trying to somehow put the genie of modernity back in the bottle. So I'm digressing a bit, but I just wanted to say that some good came out of that Woodstock generation, and that is a great amount of entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, music is in that sense Dionysian because it is intoxicating, so we're talking about what came out of that Woodstock generation, or you go back in time, Mozart, for instance, who was in a sense a Dionysian man, if we stick to that dichotomy, that represents between Apollo and Dionysian. Then yeah, Mozart and all of that, poets, and in that sense artists. But even in art, even in music, there is a great demand for discipline. I mean, music is not sound. Music is, again,
Well put.
Tonality, melody, harmony, and all of that brings together. Same as poetry. Pure poetry is not just a collage of words, but it is hard work. There is a whole issue of rhythm, of beats and rhyme and so on. So
at least some of it is. I mean, I did a show once on Just Right where I compared some of the writings of a rational type of poet like a Shakespeare to a Sam Beckett and his Logorrhea of Waiting for Godot, and or the paintings of a Michelangelo versus the paintings of a Jackson Pollock. Those kinds of things. So yes, you can have art and music and literature, which is pure, random, Dionysian garbage. And that's the only way to describe it, is garbage. And you can have the melodies, the tonalities, the rhythms of some very complex and beautiful music from, say, for example, the Beatles.
Yeah, true. I mean, absolutely. And Beatles, I suppose, train in some aspect in classical music from which they took their diversion towards what they went to. And of course, rock and jazz, there is that element of spontaneity, intuitiveness, and so on, that came to define the modern American music, which leads back to the whole discussion about modernism. And modernism, in that sense, was a rejection of what we are talking about, classical. Whether it is in art, whether it is in painting, whether it is in sculpture that you now mention, I mean, what is Picasso's painting, modernist, cubism, abstract, as opposed to, as you mentioned, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and so on, Caravaggio and other. I mean, the Renaissance painting, is
Raphael.
Raphael, exactly. So it stands out for its work in terms of symmetry, themes, and ideas that is presented to the audience, and it is hard work. It is discipline. But there is, again, the other aspect is also existing simultaneously. But I think back to Rand and back to this whole issue with which we're dealing with, the Green New Deal, the whole movement against CO2. You talk about high oil. It is the whole hydrocarbon economy, this last 120 years, that we have built, man has built. Of course, it is Western civilization that has built, that has gone from, railroads, spanning continents, to sending man to the moon, and we can point out a lot of other technological aspects of modern science. And what Rand was pointing out in her two essays, or in the collection of essays in that book, the Primitive Revolution, I think the word primitive is very emphatic over here, should be taken into account. And the essay in there, the anti-industrial revolution, it is man, which man? The Apollonian, the Dionysian man, is rejecting industry. Rejecting industry for what? To going back to his primitive state of life, as you say. There's the world where nature will provide you with. Nature was ideal. Nature was perfect. Man was completely in harmony with nature, and there was no want. And so in that large term, I mean, let's put it on the table. What we are dealing with is Marxism. Marxism pretends to be rational science. Marx had discovered the secret to the world in terms of economics, in terms of how to bring about a situation when man can once again be in unity. His reason can be in unity with nature, right? And so, as Marx himself says, I mean, there's so much of Marx that one can cite, but, his famous statement on Thesis and Feuerbach, I think it was the 11th thesis, where he says, philosophers have interpreted the world. The task is to change it, right? And to change it to what? So communism. What is communism, So communism is the highest stage of development of technology that takes man back to nature. In the sense, the first stage was primitive communism. Man was in nature. Man did what he wanted to do without being alienated. I mean, the whole idea of alienation that is in Marx, of course, it is in Freud, but in Marx, the alienation is the man who works and toils and labors, So man who was in primitive communism was a hunting, gathering man. He hunted, he fished, he did what he did to satisfy his need. He was not alienated from nature. He was completely happy with nature, and it was perfect. So it was primitive communism. But then with the development of property, with the development of, technology in its most primitive kind, but as it evolves over time, man's labor is alienated from man. That is, man becomes an alienated human being from his surrounding. Man becomes a tool of what emerges ultimately, capitalism. And capitalism totally alienates man from his surrounding, because all that ultimately the capitalism arrives at in the various stages of process, primitive communism, slave society, serfdom, and then the bourgeoisie and capitalism, is ultimately the working man has nothing. He only survives by selling his labor. His labor is expropriated by the capitalist. That is the source of the wealth. That's the secret that Marx has discovered. And now what has to do, again, capitalism lays the stage where now all the needs of man can be fulfilled, from each according to his ability, as Marx says, to each according to his need. The fullness of capitalism, that is the science and technology development, which is the Apollo man has brought it about. It is hard work, it is toil, it is and brings about a civilization that can now deliver everything to man. And all that man has to do now is do that revolution and blow it up, and that will take man back to nature. That alienation will be over. He will be reconciled, So I find that ultimately Marx is a Dionysian man, He rejects it. He wants to take man back. Of course, he doesn't talk about in practical terms of what happens. I mean, here it is. He's a mid-19th century man when capitalism is developing rapidly. We're going from the man who is laboring in the field to man that can harness energy from nature. First, the wind power, but the biggest breakthrough in the Industrial Revolution is the development of steam power, steam engine, right? Coal, and so on. And so Marx is watching this, and Marx is writing about it. The next stage that will come will be the revolution in technology with the use of hydrocarbon fuel, the development of the internal combustion engine, and that is going to transform everything. It's going to bring about the making of the modern world that we arrive at. But for Marx, all of this is simply the alienation of man by those people who are exploiting man, the vulgar capitalists. And that has to be destroyed. And so this remains a theoretical construct. He doesn't tell what the people who follow Marx will do, which is to transit from capitalism to this imaginary state of utopia where man will be reconciled with nature, his alienation will end, there will be no selfishness. Marx is talking about all that binds man as an alienated being to the structure of capitalism, that is marriage, family, and all of that relationship, religion. These are to hold man down. And all of this has to be burst aside, so he's against family, he's against marriage, he's against religion. I mean, what does he say about religion in that famous statement of his, He says religion is the sigh of the oppressed creatures, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of the soulless condition. It is the opium of the people. Yeah, these are Marx's words, So these are all of this, whether it is you're listening to Bach's Fugue, or you're listening to Handel's Messiah, these are the sigh of the oppressed people. This is, we are alienated being, and we are trying to create a utopia. But Marx knows the secret, the creation of the utopia that everyone wants to desire in that sense, or in a religious sense, going back to the Garden of Eden from where we had expelled ourselves to an act of rebellion. Is to take over the capitalist world through revolution. But the transition he doesn't describe. And now we know what the transition. It is the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is totalitarianism, right? That's what Lenin is. That's what the Bolshevik revolution is. That's who Stalin is and who Mao is and who all of these people are. I mean, Marx has seen that in the French Revolution, the Jacobins. But he doesn't, get into the ugly side of it, He's still celebrating the possibility that, we will get back into this utopia.
Yeah, the thing about Marx and any other Dionysian would be that they deny the reality of man. They deny his rational nature. Exactly. It is unnatural for man to run naked in the woods. He will die. For 50,000 years. I don't know the exact date and time, but man has always used technology. And modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens, have always used technology and has survived by it. And if we gave it up, if we stripped off all of our clothes and went into the jungle or the woods, we wouldn't last a week because we rely on our technology. It doesn't matter if it's a sharpened stone to cut a hide from an animal, and then use that leather from the animal to tie it together into clothing and footwear, or just simply rubbing two sticks together to create fire. It's technology. And our nature is to fashion nature, external nature, to suit our needs. That's what we are. That is our nature. And they deny that. They want us back in some sort of, like you say, a Garden of Eden, some fantasy world where we have to suppress our nature as rational beings who craft the world around us to suit our personal fulfillment, our own personal survival instincts and comfort instincts as well. And that's what the Dionysian is. It is a rejection of man as a rational being, that aspect of us. And I noticed in rereading the Apollo and Dionysus essay of Rand that she used Charles Lindbergh, the American hero who flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean for the very first time, used him as an example of how you can have within a person both aspects of Apollo and Dionysus. Here was this great hero, this man of rationality who used reason and rationality to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, a brave man. But he, in his writings afterwards, in later life, basically said that, I have no love of reason. I'm paraphrasing here. I have no love of the technology. I flew for the joy of it, for the emotion of it. And while he witnessed some of the Apollo program, he could not get himself to go back into that kind of rational world. And he just sort of talked about and wrote about how he is lacking in a spiritual, mystical connection to nature. And she uses him quite effectively to show that even within individuals, you don't have a dichotomy of like, that person over there is a Dionysian, this person is an Apollonian. It occurs in everybody to some degree, that we are always struggling to suppress our Dionysian nature. You don't want to get drunk. You might want to drink, but you don't want to get drunk. You know, you might want to listen to music and to dance, but you don't want to go absolutely wild and writhe in the mud like some sort of animal. So we are, this is the struggle that goes on in everybody, I would assume, and only some sort of saint out there, to use a religious term, would be a perfect objectivist, as Rand would expound. You know, she would want people to be rational and reasonable in all things. So what did you think of her using Lindbergh to express that?
No, it was a almost, I mean, I hesitate to use the word perfect, but it was almost a perfect example of what we are discussing. As you point out, I mean, Lindbergh was the first American, or for that matter, the first human being, after the Wilbur Wright brothers had shown how you can build a plane and fly, you know, and so here was the first man who flew across the Atlantic solo as a young man, you know, 42 years before the Apollo 11 mission. Apollo 11 mission was in 1969. Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic, I think it was in May of 1927. So almost to the month, 42 years earlier. He was a young man, I think 25 years old. Recently, I was in Hawaii, you know, and it just so happened I ran into, accidentally, the church going down the island of Maui, and with my wife and daughter. And I walked into this church, this beautiful little church, very simple, in a plantation, and it has been kept nice and pristine. I don't think anyone attends that church anymore, but it is there. And it is sort of a tourist site, but there were not too many people when I walked in there, hardly anyone. And that's where Charles Lindbergh is buried. You know, I was taken by surprise. I did not realize that, you know, late in his life, he had settled in Hawaii. But anyhow, that was a very, you know, serendipitous discovery. But like many others, I had read about Charles Lindbergh way back in where I come from. I was born. He was a hero. He was a hero of the Americans. He was the America First guy, you know, in the 1930s. In that sense, Donald Trump or people who have come after Charles Lindbergh are following that tradition, America First tradition. And one would have imagined, in that sense, that he would be celebrating Apollo 11, you know. I mean, he was a pilot. He had flown across the Atlantic. That's how he made his life, became a hero. And here was the next step that was being taken after what he had done, you know. And yet he was not. And as you point out, that is as Ayn Rand point out, his Dionysian self became more pronounced as he grew older than whatever was his Apollonian characteristics and feature, that he had to master the discipline that was required, the courage that was needed, the sanity. You know, you don't get intoxicated in doing what he did. You have to be very precise and control. And he did all of that. But in his later age, you know, that other aspect came. And so it's interesting what you point out about this. We are all in this situation as human beings. The Greeks had the symbol for that, and the symbol was centaur, the half man, half beast. So that's it. There is the beast inside of us. I mean, it was the words of Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare is, of course, the greatest English dramatist, poet, possibly the greatest in the world, as some people might say, and he plumbed the depths of individual human beings, in different characters, Othello and Caesar and Brutus and Macbeth and so on and so forth, and romantic characters or innocent young people falling in love, and breaking taboos, Romeo and Juliet and so on and so forth. But his greatest character, according to most students of Shakespeare, scholars of Shakespeare, is Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, the young man who is a student at Wittenberg University. And we all know the story of Hamlet, or we should know the story of Hamlet, what happens to Hamlet, his discovery and so on and so forth. Hamlet is, as so many other critics have said about Shakespeare's character, Hamlet is the profound, iconic symbol of the Western man, the enlightened man. He is the man who plumbs inside of himself, who questions himself, who reasons everything out. But then there is the other side of it. He feigns madness so that, he is not going to be taken off by the man who he discovered has killed his father and married his mother. And so in one of the lines of Hamlet is, I think it is just so phenomenally beautiful, and so perfect that Shakespeare puts words in the mouth of Hamlet. And he says, and this is what Hamlet says. He asks himself, he's talking to his two friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who actually were being set up to get Hamlet murdered by Claudius, his stepfather. But here is Hamlet sitting, and he's talking to them, and he says, what a piece of work is man. How noble in reason. Just listen to the word. What a piece of work is man. How noble in reason. How infinite in faculties, in form and moving. How like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. See, reason, apprehension, and that's Hamlet. And Hamlet is praising the construction of man, what man is. And as a rational human being, man is the supreme creation of God to those who believe, unlike Darwinian, that we came from mud, through a process of timeless evolution. No, man is the image of God. And yet, in the same speech, Hamlet then turns around in disgust and say, man does not entertain me. Man, he just dismisses it, So there is the struggle that is going on. But because of Hamlet is in that situation. So we are all in some way caught up always. But the Apollo man suppresses his Dionysian characteristics and feature. After all, he's the son of Zeus. And so he's carrying the genes that will be his brother in the fullness, Dionysian. So he suppresses it. And that suppression, where Marx has discovered, he's talking about to change the world, not to interpret the world, to change the world. Man is alienated from his labor, and man has to get back and become united in terms of his labor, that will get over his alienation and return to the state of nature. That's also Rousseau's idea, when Rousseau wrote about it, man returning back to nature, There is the other theme, that the discovery that takes place. Again, 19th century man, a few decades younger than Marx, and that is Freud. And it is Freud that plumbs into the depths of human psychology, the neuroses, and what drives man. And for him, for Freud, the alienation is the alienation of man from his libido. I mean, Freud sets up the situation between eros and thanatos. Eros, from which comes, eroticism, that is the sexual desire, the sex instinct in man. And thanatos is the death instinct, So for Freud, the alienation is the suppression of eros, the libido. And that is necessary for a civilization to emerge. And a civilization, the more it advances, the more it progresses, the more it becomes complicated in its development and advancement, the greater is the suppression of eros, that is the libido. Because what is the libido? The first principle of life, in the sense, the life instinct, is the sexual desire. It's a reproduction, and man, in this explanation, man, if he gives full freedom and is not alienated from eros, from his libidinal drive, he can remain totally bound up in the pleasure principle, which is what he sets up. The pleasure principle, the gratification of whatever gives us joy. And the ultimate joy is that exercise, the freedom of our libido, So if freedom for Freud and the idea of Freud was further developed by people like Herbert Marcuse, is if freedom is to be free from repression, then one has to be free from civilization, because civilization is toil, is work. So pleasure principle on the one side, and the other side is the reality principle. Civilization is reality principle. Freud wrote that famous little essay. In this discussion, it becomes very significant. Is civilization and its discontent. That as civilization progresses, as civilization becomes more and more complicated, we have to repress. What is civilization? Civilization is, take the example of saving, the birth of capitalism. Saving is postponement of immediate gratification, right? So that's where saving comes. The act of saving is a learned effort. It is a discipline, So you save for a future,
That's fascinating, Salim. And you're defining once again an aspect of the left, and that is that they require instant gratification and they want things given to them, which is why they turn to the state or they turn to somebody else to provide for them, because they don't want to lift a finger. They think that they are entitled to instant gratification, living for the moment, not thinking about the future, even though they feign that. For example, in the environmentalist movement, they think about, let's think of the children, and because the planet's warming and the polar bears are disappearing, which they're not. And that is false. That is a false assertion of theirs, that they try to think of the future. They are not. They're thinking of themselves and the destruction of everything around them that is actually giving them the warmth and the comfort and the survivability that they require as human beings, because the left is a death cult. There's the Thanos again. And it wants to destroy. It wants something now. They are like petulant children. They are part of the forces of entropy in the world, that being the tendency to maximum disorder and chaos and randomness. And that is that push into that direction. And I'm reminded of just a small digression. I'm reminded of a novel by a series of novels by Orson Scott Card called the Alvin Maker series, where in it he talks about this man, Alvin Maker, who had to construct things to keep the forces of entropy at bay, because that is the tendency of the world, is to, in the cosmological sense, into absolute disorder. But of course, in the here and now, in the moment, it is not that. We are constructed. We are physical beings of order and nature and rules. And so that aspect of the left, it keeps coming back, all these definitions, trying to define what the psychological and philosophic motivations of these people, these insane people, are. And this is just one more, is that they are lazy. They don't want to work. They are forces of entropy. They are forces of chaos and disorder. They are, they want everything simply right now. Gratify me right now. Give it to me right now. Forget the future.
Yeah, I think you use the most appropriate words in this exchange that we're having: entropy, which is ultimately, a science principle, the second law of thermodynamics, the gradual loss of energy, heat loss, leads to the complete dissolution of anything, and end and death. The natural state is not energy, heat, it is coldness and end. So the irony, global warming is a lot of effort of nature to keep the world warm. Otherwise, there wouldn't be life, because the opposite of it would be freezing, darkness. I mean, the death of stars is the sign of dissolution that takes place. And our own, if you go by scientific calculations and explanations, once the sun has, our star has consumed all of its resources to keep burning and fusing and creating energy and heat, the sun will die, and with that will be the end of our system, our solar system, and so on. And yet, the people, that is the Dionysian aspect of mankind that has now running the West, wants to turn down the heat, to destroy the heat source. They don't even want to ask themselves what it would mean, because they celebrate the instant gratification. They want to return to nature. And as you correctly say, they want to return to the death principle, the thanatos, and their celebration of Eros is in fact a process, a ritual, rather than the creative principle of Apollo. It is the death principle of Thanatos that is at work. They want to basically live their life in terms of instant gratification, the pleasure principle, and that is to give a complete unrestrained, unconstrained exercise to the libido, whereas in the Apollonian sense, Eros itself has to be disciplined. It is not that you deny Eros, but it has to be disciplined into an order out of which civilization is built.
If you remember reading through the essay, there was newspaper interviews with some of the attendees at Woodstock.
Yeah.
And they talked specifically about that. One woman, they talked to, a young 20-year-old. They asked her, did you plan? Did you bring food with you? And I think she said she brought some carrots. Did you know that you were not going to be able to buy food when you were there? we thought maybe would be provided. Somebody threw a box of Cocoa Puffs and it hit me on the head. Somebody said, grab a handful and pass it on, quite literally. Or there was a watermelon that had been communally bitten into that they just handed it on. Living in the range of the moment, no planning. So some people, they did not, as she quite correctly and literally says in the book, in the essay, they didn't have the sense to come in out of the rain. They did not plan. They didn't have no foresight. And about eros, about sex at Woodstock, because this was the era of free love and many partners and just do whatever you feel like, whenever you feel like. They did say that when interviewed that, that went on, but we were somewhat constrained, perhaps by their own upbringing, I don't know, the society they lived in, but they waited till darkness, to do it. I don't know, maybe out of a sense of shame, like Adam and Eve when they bit from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. I don't know, but it's fascinating that Rand would put all of this in that short 30-page odd essay that describes and has survived 50 years to describe the left.
Yeah, and what Rand puts there becomes now, reading it 50 years plus years later, that this is now, in a sense, the archetype of what is ultimately the result of a Dionysian culture. Is a total breakdown. It is total entropy, as you just used the word. Everything collapses, and it is living in the mud. And they want to sing, and that was what Charles Lindbergh's point was, your feet is in the mud and you reach for the stars, or something of that nature, and characteristic. And Ayn Rand flips it around and says, no, it is reaching for the star is reason. It is science, and that is hard work and discipline. So the Woodstock as the significance or symbol of where we are going or where we are heading is the complete removal of all of the rules, regulations, barriers, boundaries, demarcation that is required in the construction of an ordered society. And so freedom, remember, Burke talks about freedom in an ordered society. It is a distinction, a critical distinction that we oftentimes forget, that freedom is not licentiousness. And licentiousness is the Dionysian characteristic. So what we are having, I mean, you look at it, this is the age that we're living. Those who were there at Woodstock and the generation of Woodstock, that is my generation that was at Woodstock, and where we are 50 years later, these are the people who are running the world. The Neil Armstrongs of this world, the people who built the Apollo, the greatest generation, they are dead and gone. I was listening the other day to some friends talking about they're in medicine, and they were talking about visiting veterans during Remembrance Day. And this was with a group of friends in the United States. And they were saying that you go to a hospital on Remembrance Day to just even hold a hand or sit and listen to and talk to the veterans over there. You find that the veterans today who are there are veterans from the wars of the Iraq wars, the Afghan wars. There are very few, if any, still around from the Korean War. There's none from the Second World War. I mean, it would be a rare case that if there is someone still alive from the Second World War. Recently, in American Thinker, I read an article, again, after this Remembrance Day, of a man writing that he visited a veteran home, and there was this 100-year-old veteran who had fought in Okinawa, in Iwo Jima, He was 100 years old. And he sat with him and he spoke with him. And this 100-year-old, he was a Marine in Iwo Jima. He broke down in tears and he was crying. And in the course of the conversation with him, he was crying not about what he had gone through as a young man, barely out of his teenage years. He must have been about 20 years old if he's 100 years old now, in Iwo Jima, around about that, early 20. The hardship, the battle, the wounds, the people that were around him who fell, and so on and so forth. He was not recollecting them. He was crying about what has happened to his America, the very things that he fought for. And the people with him, he was, and who died and never came back home. They fought for freedom. They fought for what the greatest generation subsequently built. And now, as he's sitting where he is sitting, or residing where he's residing in the veteran home, is looking around and crying because it seems it was all a waste of his generation. Because the generation that is now empowered, the people around Biden and the people, around Nancy Pelosi and all of them, and coming down in that age group, that is people on the left in particular, the Democratic Party. This is the party that came out of the Woodstock generation. And they are determined to transform the experience of Woodstock generation, of which they were a part, and what they celebrated and what they bought into actual policy terms to take America back to the primitive age. And if we stick with, for the moment, with, again, this Freudian side of the example of alienation, that is pleasure principle, and the opposite of the reality principle, America, that became what America was after 1945 till, sometime we might say the end of the Cold War, the greatest superpower, and what was symbolized by Apollo 11 that we began talking about. A civilization that exceeded anything that one would have imagined as a science fiction that America had arrived in the 1960s and 70s. This generation, the Woodstock generation, is in rebellion against that achievement and wants to basically, take it apart, destroy it systematically, and celebrate it and say that this is our achievement. And where does it begin? It begins by, rejecting all the very principle, and I would now here say Christian principle, because after all, we're talking about America, about the West, and the values that went into building what the greatest generation ultimately succeeded in building was on the foundation that is at heart Christian, with its values, with its belief, with its faith, with its hard work. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, pointed out in one of his most famous books, The Protestant Ethic and the Making of Capitalism, he talked about what is the Protestant ethics. It is, again, the postponement of the instant gratification in whatever aspect that you're seeking your instant gratification. And of course, sex becomes the most important attribute of it. It's the postponement of that to create the savings to build for the future. So Protestant ethic and capitalism, it is the denial of the instant gratification. And it is denial of the instant gratification based upon a religious comprehension or conception of the world. Well, all of that has to be negated and nullified. So Marx began with it. Family is exploitation, marriage is exploitation, it is exploitation of man over woman, and so on, And where have we come to? Well, the next, we saw in the process over the last 20 years, the meaning of marriage in the Christian sense We are in North America, so here we are talking in the Christian sense. The meaning of marriage in the Christian sense, a union of man and woman, has been dissolved. Marriage, there's no question of, a man and a woman. It can be two men, it can be two women, it can be whatever, So that institution has been dissolved. What is the next institution that will be dissolved? Well, homosexuality became something that can be celebrated, should be celebrated. There should be no interference by state or by any institution that speaks to an order, that is the church, for instance, or the universities, for instance. Well, no, that is freedom. So homosexuality, lesbianism, all of that is part of the freedom. Well, what is the next boundary? It is staring right in our face right now as we are speaking. It is pedophilia. It is going to be pedophilia. There is going to be no restraint, nothing. The sexualization of children that is taking place,
You remind me of a thought I was having recently about these people, the Stop Oil, the environmentalists, and even the political homosexual movement. And that is that while everybody is free to reject fossil fuels, I call them organic fuels, but fossil fuels, everybody is free to become a hunter-gatherer if they so wish. Just go down to the Serengeti, knock on the hut of the San tribe and ask to be let back in, to go back to your 50,000-year-old roots. Everybody is free to do and to act how they want to personally. But what a lot of these people are doing is they are politicizing it all. It's not just enough for me as an environmentalist to give up oil, to give up eating meat, to give up my nature in certain respects and to go back to nature. You have to do it as well.
Right.
And you and you and you. Everybody has to follow me into this devolution of man. Everybody has to do it in unison as a community, as a commune. And then we'll all live together in peace and harmony and sing Kumbaya. That's where it rankles.
Well,
because people are free to act the way they want, but they're not free to impose it on other people.
Well, again, back to that two archetypes. Not that we are in a sense a mix of those two archetypes in different proportion, right? And so one has to repress the other to make meaning and sense out of what is our preferred archetype that we want to be, an Apollo man or a Dionysian man, So in that archetypical sense, a Dionysian man is a mass man. He's intoxicated. I mean, there it was in Woodstock. It is a mass orgy, And if you are in Woodstock, in the company of this mass of humanity engaging in whatever is happening there, and you stand out and say, no, I'm going to be a reasonable human being. I'm going to bring my food. I'll have my tent. You will be at an odd place. You will not be a Dionysian man, because ultimately an Apollo man, a man of reason that Hamlet celebrate, what a piece of work is man, is the end result in himself and in his work, a solitary person. Michelangelo builds the most beautiful representation of that in a statue of David, right? It is him casting in stone David. And you look up at David and you see the Apollo man, You might see also a Dionysian man in there, because there is also in that, the libido is there, It's all open. But the act, the performance, the making that goes into what Michelangelo does cannot be a mass project, Newton's Principia Mathematica, Principia, is not a mass project. Einstein's special theory of relativity is not a mass project. He's alone. He's walking through whatever it is. and he's struggling with trying to understand whatever that he's trying to understand of nature and penetrate that secret, out of which comes this modern world that, we have both in the case of Newton, in the case of Einstein, and that's again what Freud is pointing out, because what they did is the making of civilization. They did it as individual. They brought it together, So Euclid and his geometry, Aristotle and his philosophy. So the Apollo man is not a mass man. What has happened is the rise of the Dionysian man is the rise of the mass man. There is no order. There's chaos. Behind this mass man is fascism, is totalitarianism, And also, as you point out, because of entropy, it is a death cult, So Europe is now facing the death cult. It built up its whole new Green Deal on cheap energy source that Russia provided. But in a fitting, intoxicated mood of their tantrum, they went into this full spectrum sanction against Russia on Ukraine, defending Ukraine for what? That went against all the principle that the Americans should instinctively have understood or rationally should have understood, that there are red lines that cannot be crossed. So they crossed it, they brought about a war, and now they're going to face the end of what that war means. As they put the full spectrum sanction, the winter is here. Hyperinflation, shortage of fuel, shortage of electric power, they're going to freeze. That's the Dionysian man. That's the death cult. That's entropy they're feeding. So to bring this all together, none of this discussion, none of this thinking through, none of this assessment is taking place in a much wanted media that exists. New York Times won't write about it. Washington Post won't write about it. The Atlantic Monthly, the Canadian, saying there's no discussion, there's no serious questioning in the parliament. And anybody who does that is then deplatformed and removed. Because the Dionysian man cannot engage in a rational discussion. And that's the lesson I found embedded in going back to Ayn Rand's essay from 50 years ago. And I wish some people will pick up Ayn Rand's, this particular volume of essays, which can be easily found if they Google for them, and read them and see what a hoax that is being perpetrated by the generation of Woodstock upon their children and grandchildren who are coming along.
Yeah. Agreed. Let me finish off, if I could, Salim, by just mentioning the last two paragraphs she mentions in this Apollo and Dionysus essay. She says, "You have all heard the old bromide to the effect that man has his eyes on the stars and his feet in the mud. It is usually taken to mean that man's reason and his physical senses are the element pulling him down to the mud, while his mystical, supra-rational emotions are the element that lifts him to the stars. This," she says, "is the grimmest inversion of many in the course of mankind's history. But last summer, that is August of '69, reality offered you a literal dramatization of the truth. It is man's irrational emotions that bring him down to the mud," Woodstock. "It is man's reason that lifts him to the stars," Apollo. Thanks for reviving this, Salim. Fascinating discussion. It had elements of everything I'm very much interested in: the Apollo program, space program, Ayn Rand, cosmology, politics, philosophy. Fascinating. Thank you again for a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.